Hello, everybody. In this video, we're going to introduce the Gospel of Mark. So let's begin with the author of Mark. Traditionally, the author is known as John Mark, actually, is his name. We meet a guy named John Mark in Acts 12, verse 12. When this had dawned on him, it says, and the him is Peter, after he had just escaped from prison, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. So this verse establishes for us a couple things. There was a guy named John Mark who had a connection with Peter. And the connection specifically, church fathers tell us, is that Mark actually bases his gospel on the preaching of Peter, probably from the city of Rome. So there's no internal evidence. In other words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, we've already said, the authors are anonymous. Mark never says, "Hi, I'm Mark, I'm writing this gospel." But there is external evidence, meaning church fathers such as these three here, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Papias, 1st, 2nd century AD Christians, they all testify to the fact that Mark, John Mark, based his gospel, the Gospel of Mark, on the testimony of Peter. So here's a quote from one of them, Papias, saying, "Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he had remembered based on what Peter had shared with him." When did this happen, though? Likely after 64 AD. This is when the Great Fire of Rome breaks out. So here is Emperor Nero, the emperor at the time of Rome. Kind of a crazy guy, going insane, likely by this point in history, historians tell us. Maybe even set this fire in Rome, the city of Rome himself, so that he would have a good excuse to blame Christians, to target them, to persecute them, to kill them. Paul and Peter likely are both killed. They're both martyred for their faith during this period of Nero's reign. So here's a picture of Peter being crucified upside down, the tradition says, because he did not want to die the same way Jesus died. Wow. So another clue that this was written from Rome, Peter meeting Mark in Rome before he is martyred there. Written to Gentile Christians, though, in Rome specifically, too. Another clue that this is written to Gentiles in that city, not Jews like Matthew's gospel, but non-Jews, Gentiles. Another clue is this. Mark explains Jewish customs to his audience. He takes the time, for example, in Mark 7:3 to say, "The Pharisees and Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders." Mark wouldn't need to explain that to his audience if they were Jews and already understood this, right? So the point is, this clues us in that Mark's audience is Gentile. They don't know this stuff, so Mark has to explain this. So written from Rome, Peter passing this on to John Mark before he dies, to Gentile Christians living in Rome that are probably suffering as well because of Nero's reign and because of being blamed for this and other reasons. What else can we know about Mark the man, though? John Mark. What else can we know about him from Scripture? Well, he was the son of a woman named Mary, we read. He traveled with Paul, the Apostle Paul, and Barnabas on the first missionary journey that Acts tells us about. Barnabas and Mark were actually cousins, so maybe why Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas on that first trip. On the second journey, though, Paul actually rejects Mark. Mark and Barnabas actually go their own way, and Paul and Silas go their own way. Two groups of missionary tag teams split from each other over Mark actually deserting Paul and Barnabas halfway through their first missionary journey. So Paul has had it. We can't trust this guy. He left us. Barnabas, though, wanted to take him probably because they're cousins, right? And he's got a closer relationship with him than Paul did. Mark and Paul end up reconciling, though. So Paul forgives Mark for deserting them. He ends up calling him his fellow worker in the gospel in Philemon. Peter, likely because of that connection, was passing on what he had learned and experienced from Jesus to Mark, calls him his spiritual son. And Mark even possibly had contact with Jesus. So take a look at this second verse here. This is from Mark's gospel, right after Jesus gets arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. "A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." So this is maybe Mark kind of anonymously identifying himself as this young man who flees. And both of these passages together kind of show us when push comes to shove, Mark is maybe admitting, especially in this passage, he wasn't always the most reliable guy. And yet, like we see time and time again in Scripture, God uses Mark anyway. He becomes clearly an important figure in the early church movement, and he ends up being inspired to write this gospel. So pretty incredible still. Purpose theme. Mark presents Jesus as the Son of Man and the Son of God. So the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is the first verse of Mark. It's the Son of Man, the Son of God, who came to suffer as a servant, though. So even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Son of Man, first of all, it's a word that means human being or mortal, and when it's used in the Old Testament. So it's a human figure, but it's also used in Daniel 7 particularly to talk about a figure who someday is going to share a throne with the Ancient of Days, God, in other words, and be given an everlasting kingdom that's never going to be destroyed. After each of these beasts, we looked at this vision previously in Daniel, are destroyed one by one. So remember, there's 4 beasts in Daniel that represent each of the different empires throughout the time between Old and New Testament. One by one, they're going to fall. The Son of Man, the human one, is going to share the throne with God, and his kingdom's going to last forever. The question, though, is this: as Jesus keeps calling himself Son of Man throughout the gospel, what kind of Son of Man is Jesus? He's fully human, right? So he fits that definition. But is he going to conquer the kingdoms? Is he going to crush Rome, the final beast, like everybody's expecting? Well, no, right? This is the way that Jesus is going to win the victory and be enthroned with God, through the cross. So that's the challenge that Mark especially presents for us as we read. What kind of Son of Man is Jesus? The Son of God as well, though, of course. His power is displayed as the Son of God, as a divine being. God himself in the flesh. Power over the physical world, demons, disease, death. But his power is especially displayed through, in a paradoxical way, his being willing to serve. So if we want to follow Jesus, discipleship involves suffering like Jesus does, serving like Jesus does. You're only going to be great, Mark says, if you serve, if you become the servant of many like Jesus. Jesus is the suffering servant in particular. It's a good passage to keep in mind. Isaiah 53, he was bruised and crushed for our iniquities, and by his wounds we are healed. It's through suffering, through serving, through dying that Jesus especially shows that he is the Son of God, even though, again, this is not what exactly his listeners are expecting. Some unique characteristics of Mark. It's the shortest gospel. It's only got 16 chapters, but it's quite detailed in places. It's got a vivid, rough style. I kind of think of a handheld camera, kind of jerky, kind of shaky at times. Details that come up that are very vivid, that just really hit you.
Lizzie Kuipers, would you visit the office, please?
It's a gospel of action. 19 miracles. So based on its shortness, it's proportionally got the most miracles of any gospel. And throughout, immediately, over 40 times that word is used. So the action just keeps moving throughout the gospel. And it's a gospel of emotion. So Jesus' emotions are on display. Compassion, anger, sorrow, sighing. Emotions of others. They're amazed, they're fearful, they're joyful, they hate, they show sorrow. A gospel of vivid emotion as well. Here's one detail that we get in Mark, just to give you an example of something that Mark includes, the vivid kind of rough detail, the uncut version that Matthew and Luke don't necessarily include. So it just says Jesus was sleeping in each of Matthew and Luke's account of Jesus calming the storm. Mark remembers, though, maybe from Peter sharing this, that Jesus was specifically sleeping on a cushion. So kind of interesting one detail in Mark's documentary of sorts about Jesus that is included in there, that the others do not include. Finally, it's a gospel of passion. Halfway through the gospel, from chapter 8 through 16, the attention turns to Jesus going to suffer, Jesus going to die in Jerusalem. So the challenge, the question as we conclude is this: are we prepared to follow and suffer with Jesus on the way to the cross? For Mark's audience then, Gentile Christians suffering in Rome, and for us today, are we going to humble ourselves? Are we going to deny ourselves and follow Jesus, even if it means rejection and possibly death for us as well?